What if America had kept its promises? It's a question that echoes like a ghost across American history. After the Civil War, 4 million enslaved men, women, and children were legally free for the first time. The Union had triumphed, the Confederacy was destroyed, and slavery, the institution that had shaped the United States since its very beginning, was abolished. It was a moment unlike any other, filled with both terror and possibility. Imagine what that meant for a people who had been bound in chains for centuries, to suddenly walk into a world where the law no longer recognized their bondage. The possibilities were staggering, and so were the challenges. Could America truly remake itself? Could a nation built on slavery transform into a land of freedom? This is the great question of Reconstruction. The 12 turbulent years between 1865 and 1877, when the United States tried and failed to answer. Abraham Lincoln had spoken of a new birth of freedom, but Lincoln was struck down by an assassin's bullet just days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Leadership passed to Andrew Johnson, a Southerner who sympathized with many of the very people the war had been fought against. In his hands, the promise of freedom was fragile, and yet, for a brief moment, it seemed as though the country might take a bold step forward. Reconstruction was not only about rebuilding the South's shattered economy or reuniting the nation. It was about redefining the meaning of America itself. Would the principles written in the Declaration of Independence finally apply to all? Or would freedom be a hollow word, paper thin, and quickly discarded? Tonight, we tell the story of a revolution betrayed, of promises made and broken, of violence and compromise, and of how the dream of equality was crushed before it could take root. At the end of the Civil War, hope was real and palpable. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 officially ended slavery. The 14th Amendment in 1868 went further, declaring that all people born or naturalized in the United States were citizens entitled to equal protection under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment promised that the right to vote would not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. On paper, these amendments marked the most radical expansion of rights in American history. For freedmen and women, they represented the dawn of a new world. Across the South, the Freedmen's Bureau sprang to life. This agency was tasked with helping former slaves transition into freedom, and while underfunded and understaffed, it performed miracles. Schools rose from the ashes of war, staffed by Northern teachers and by freedmen themselves. In these classrooms, children who had once been forbidden to read and write eagerly traced letters on chalkboards, while adults filled benches determined to seize education at last. Literacy, once a crime punishable by whipping or mutilation under slavery, became a revolutionary act of self-liberation. At the same time, economic independence was the burning dream. The phrase, 40 acres and a mule, spread across black communities like wildfire. General William Tecumseh Sherman had issued Field Order 15, setting aside coastal lands in Georgia and South Carolina for settlement by freedmen. Thousands moved onto these lands, building cabins, tilling soil, and planting crops with the hope of building generational wealth for the first time in their lives. For a brief moment, the dream felt real. But Andrew Johnson, who assumed the presidency after Lincoln's death, crushed it. Johnson issued blanket pardons to Confederates, returning confiscated lands to their former owners. Freed families who had just begun new lives were evicted, forced off land they had cultivated. The dream of independent farming collapsed into the reality of sharecropping. Under sharecropping contracts, freedmen rented land from white owners and paid with a share of their harvest. On paper, this offered autonomy. In practice, it bound families to cycles of debt, with landowners manipulating accounts to ensure that freedmen never broke free. It was slavery by another name. Still, freed people resisted. They formed churches, the beating heart of black communities, where preachers became leaders and congregations gathered strength. They fought for schools, for fair wages, for dignity. Reconstruction was alive, but it was fragile, balanced between hope and betrayal. For the first time in American history, African Americans became political actors on a massive scale. Freedmen registered to vote in droves, seizing the rights guaranteed by the 15th Amendment. Across the South, black men went to the polls, some for the very first time, and cast ballots that reshaped the political map. Their participation ushered in governments that reflected a more diverse America than had ever existed. Hiram Revels of Mississippi took a seat in the U.S. Senate, replacing Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. Think of the symbolism. The very chamber that had once defended slavery now seated a black man as a lawmaker. Blanche K. Bruce followed him, serving a full term as senator. At the state level, hundreds of African Americans were elected to legislatures, school boards, and local governments. South Carolina even had a legislature with a black majority, a radical reversal of power. These Reconstruction governments were not perfect, but they were ambitious. They established the South's first public school systems, built hospitals and orphanages, invested in infrastructure, and passed civil rights protections, outlawing racial discrimination in public spaces. They represented an attempt to transform the South into something new, something inclusive. Yet white elites could not accept this. They railed against Negro rule, claiming that Reconstruction was an experiment in chaos. Northern newspapers repeated these lies, painting the South as a region drowning in corruption under black leadership. The truth was that corruption existed everywhere in the Gilded Age, North and South alike, but the charge was used as a weapon to delegitimize black political participation. For former Confederates, seeing formerly enslaved men hold office was intolerable. To them, Reconstruction was not democracy, it was humiliation. The backlash was building, and it would soon explode into violence. The opponents of Reconstruction did not rely on arguments alone. They turned to terror. In 1866, in Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan was born. Draped in white hoods and robes, they rode by night, burning homes, whipping freedmen, and lynching leaders who dared to stand tall. The Klan targeted black schools and churches. Knowing these were the foundations of community and resistance, teachers were beaten, schoolhouses torched, congregations attacked. The message was clear: freedom would be punished with blood. But the Klan was only one face of organized terror. In Louisiana, the White League emerged, functioning like an army with open defiance of law. In Mississippi and South Carolina, the red shirts marched openly through towns, rifles in hand, intimidating voters. Election days often became battlegrounds. In Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, over 100 black men were massacred after defending a courthouse against a white mob. It was one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. Yet in its aftermath, the killers went unpunished. The U.S. Supreme Court would later overturn federal charges, declaring the government powerless to act against individuals. Terror became politics. These massacres were not random. They were calculated campaigns to suppress the black vote and overthrow Reconstruction governments. By the mid-1870s, entire states saw elections decided not by ballots but by the barrel of a gun. The Mississippi Plan of 1875 was explicit: use intimidation and violence to ensure democratic victories. And it worked. The federal government intervened at times, sending troops to suppress uprisings, but these efforts were inconsistent, undermined by lack of political will. Freedmen lived in constant fear, but they also resisted, organizing militias, arming themselves, and continuing to vote despite threats. Still, the tide of terror was relentless, and without firm federal protection, freedom was shrinking. While the South bled, the North turned inward. The Panic of 1873 triggered a deep economic depression. Factories closed, railroads failed, unemployment soared. Northern workers demanded attention to their struggles, not Southern problems. Corruption scandals in President Ulysses S. Grant's administration further eroded public trust. Newspapers increasingly portrayed Reconstruction as a failure, echoing Southern propaganda that black self-government was impossible. The energy that had fueled abolition cooled into indifference. Meanwhile, the courts gutted the legal foundations of freedom. In the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment protected only a narrow set of national rights, leaving most civil rights under state control. In 1876, United States v. Cruikshank overturned the convictions of the Colfax Massacre's perpetrators, declaring that the federal government had no authority to protect citizens from private acts of violence. With these decisions, the federal shield vanished, leaving freedmen at the mercy of hostile states and mobs. Republicans in Congress, once champions of radical Reconstruction, began to waver. The party faced electoral losses, scandals, and fatigue. Many white Northerners had never embraced racial equality deeply. They had fought to save the Union, not necessarily to transform it. Now, with the South resisting and the North weary, Reconstruction's foundation cracked. The dream of a multiracial democracy was giving way to the politics of abandonment. The final collapse came in 1877. The presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden was one of the most contested in U.S. history. Tilden won the popular vote, but electoral votes from several states were disputed. The nation stood on the brink of crisis. Behind closed doors, a deal was made, the Compromise of 1877. Hayes would become president, but in exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. With that decision, Reconstruction ended. Without federal troops to enforce civil rights, Southern whites moved swiftly to reassert dominance. Redeemer governments, white supremacist regimes claiming to redeem the South from Reconstruction, took power. They dismantled reforms, slashed funding for schools, and erased protections for black citizens. Within a decade, Jim Crow laws codified segregation into every corner of life: schools, transportation, neighborhoods, even water fountains. Voting rights were stripped away through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. By the 1890s, black voter turnout in the South had plummeted. Violence was used to enforce this new order. Lynchings became a horrific ritual of racial control, with thousands murdered over the coming decades. The promise of Reconstruction, the hope of equality, land, and political voice, was obliterated. What had begun as a revolution ended in betrayal. Reconstruction was the greatest missed opportunity in American history. For 12 years, the nation hovered on the edge of transformation. Freedmen built schools, voted, held office, and carved out lives of dignity in the face of immense resistance. They proved that freedom was not only possible, but vibrant. Yet violence, racism, political compromise, and indifference crushed their progress. Reconstruction became an unfinished revolution, one that left its battles to be fought again during the civil rights movement nearly a century later. The betrayal of Reconstruction shows us that freedom is not permanent, that rights once granted can be stripped away if not protected. It asks us to consider, what if America had stayed the course? What if land reform had been real, if the North had refused to retreat, if federal troops had remained, and if the courts had defended justice instead of undermining it? Would America have become a true multiracial democracy a century earlier? These questions haunt our history, and they remind us that the struggle for equality did not end in 1877. It continues today. What do you think about today's video? Was Reconstruction doomed from the start, or was it stolen by those who could not bear to share power? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.